Hello, students. Today we're going to be talking about microbes, and I am so excited for this lecture. I can't even tell you. I've been very interested in microbes since I was pregnant, and I learned all about how important microbes are during the birthing process and how fetuses are sterile. They have no microorganisms within their bodies until they pass through the vaginal birth canal, which is teeming with microbes and helps to populate their bodies with microorganisms for the first time in their lives. So I learned all sorts of fascinating things about microbes and your microbiome, and I'm going to talk to you about what I've learned. So this week we will first start with talking about what is a microbiome. So I just gave you some hints about what a microbiome is, but I'll say more about what a microbiome is in the first place, what it does for us. And then we will talk about microbes and disease. Next, we will talk about microbes and us, how we can understand the relation between a human and their microbiome. And I will leave you with some questions to consider. So what is a microbiome? Well, microbiomes are a collection of microscopic organisms that live in and on your body. The microbial cells in your body, that is the cells that make up your microbiome, outnumber your own cells by 10 to 1, which means there are 10 times as many cells of these other microorganisms that are not you genetically than there are cells that comprise your own body. Fascinatingly, your microbiome may weigh up to 5 pounds. So think about how heavy that is. That's like a big watermelon or something. That's a lot of weight in our bodies that is comprised of these other organisms that are living on us. Microbes play important roles in your body's functions, including digestion. They play important roles in the development of your immune system, which we're going to talk about. And they may even affect how you feel and behave. And for more about that, I've included a Radiolab podcast for this week's material, which talks about how they tested the effects of the presence of different bacteria within mice and how that actually affected mouse behavior in some experiments they did. So I hope you enjoy that Radiolab podcast. But the short part of the short story is that microbes are important to how you are as a person. They're important not just to being able to digest your food and fight off diseases, but even to thinking about how you feel and how you act as a person. That's what the evidence is suggesting. Okay, so where do microbes come from? Where do these microorganisms get into our body from? Well, I already said that they come from birth. Okay, if your mother had a vaginal birth, now if she doesn't, some people actually recommend swabbing your vagina if you give birth and wiping the secretions from your vagina onto the newborn baby to make sure that they get some of these super healthy microorganisms. If you have a C-section, for example, and don't have a vaginal birth, you can still transmit your microorganisms, parts of your microbiome to your infant in this way. And there are also microbes in breast milk, which is another way that we get microbes early on into our bodies. But in general, microbes also get into our bodies from the environment that we live and grow up in and the things we eat and the dirt that we encounter. If you play in the dirt, if you dig a garden, or if you have wildlife around your house, if you keep your windows open, microbes can get into your house that way. There are microbes in your shower. If you take off the shower head and look inside, those are microorganisms that are interacting with you within your environment. And you can also eat microorganisms, and that's called probiotics, right? We put organisms into food that are good for us to keep us healthy. So like yogurt, for example, and sauerkraut, cheeses, some cheeses, pickles, kombucha and kimchi. These are all examples of foods that have probiotics in them. Probiotics are just good microbes, microorganisms that are good for your body. Okay, so So we're going to start with this article by Rob Dunn, who teaches here at NCSU. And we're going to talk about the relationship between microbes and disease, what we've learned in the past decade or so about how microbes actually, how having a healthy microbiome is important for fighting off certain kinds of disease. And then we're going to look at, after this article, we're going to look at the second article I signed, Health, Ecology, and the Microbiome, because I think the presence of these organisms on our bodies raises fundamental questions about biology and how we think of our own individuality and what we are even as human beings, and the nature of this class, which is called humans and the environment. The fact that we have these organisms living on our skin and in our bodies really calls into question, I think, that distinction that underlies the whole class, which is that humans and the environment are two distinct things, and we're looking at how they interact and how they connect. The idea that all these organisms are actually inhabiting our bodies suggests that the environment is partly in our bodies in some sense. And so the question arises whether these organisms are actually part of us, the way your heart and your kidneys are part of your body, or are they part of your environment? And so we're going to talk more about those kinds of questions later on in this lecture when we look at the second article. But to start out, we're going to talk about some of these fascinating studies that have shown that there is a link between disease and having a healthy microbiome. So we'll start with this article, Letting Biodiversity Get Under Our Skin by Rob Dunn. So Dunn starts by noting that we're at the crossroads of three major transformations of the world. One is that we've migrated to cities. So in the past 100 years, 100 years ago, or we look at 1900, most people lived in rural agricultural communities. They lived on farms. We were farmers primarily in our past as a human species. And 100 years ago, most people lived on farms, so they had more contact with the natural world, more contact with different forms of a variety of life. And now most people live in cities. I think in 1900, there were only 2 cities with more than 1 million people, and now there are like dozens of cities with tens of millions of people and more. So that's been a huge transformation in where humanity lives and how close they are to nature and how close they are to biodiversity. When we lived in rural communities, in localized groups on farms, we had much more intimate connection with the nature around us than now, where you can pretty much spend your whole life on cement and other man-made surfaces if you want to. Okay, so the first major transformation that he notes is this move to the cities. And we're going to talk more in the class about how that affected us. The second major transformation is the loss of biodiversity, and we'll talk in a little bit about how we are eliminating biodiversity, but there's been a tremendous loss in biodiversity, and we've already talked about that a lot, how we're part of this 6th mass extinction, so we're watching species go extinct daily. Dozens of species go extinct every day, and we've lost up to 75% of all the insects in the world, for example, which we talked about. But so this loss of biodiversity is one of the transformations that characterizes the era that we live in. And the third transformation is a rise in allergies and chronic inflammatory disease. So in order to understand, to make sense of this article, it's important to know that allergies and inflammatory diseases are problems with your immune system. They indicate problems with an immune system. And the problem is that the immune system treats something that's harmless, like pollen or a peanut, if you have an allergy to pollen or peanuts, as if it's harmful, and it ends up attacking your own cells, or cells that are innocuous that the immune system isn't aware are innocuous. So when you have an allergy, that's what's happening in your body. And when you have this kind of chronic inflammatory disease where your body is constantly thinking that its own cells or other innocuous cells are harmful, then it results in inflammation and problems with your body because your body is attacking itself. So these are all immune problems, immune-related problems. Okay, so that's one thing to understand to make sense of the links that we're going to draw between these three transformations. Okay, so we start early on in the article with this thing called the hygiene hypothesis. And that hypothesis grew out of this observation that farm kids who grew up on farms, were less likely to have allergies than kids who grew up in cities. And the hypothesis posits that the reason for this difference is that, what I was saying earlier, is that when you're in a city, you're too far removed from the diversity of wildlife and microbes for your immune system to develop properly. Okay, so like I was saying, farm kids are closer to nature, they're closer to the biodiversity around them, and they're less likely to have allergies as a result of that. This is the hypothesis that the lower chances of having allergies are due to this less decreased exposure to biodiversity, and specifically microbial diversity, and that this lack of exposure actually hindered the development of their immune system. So because they didn't have exposure to a diverse set of microbes, they were unable to build the right kind of immune system. Okay, so Hansky, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he noticed that he sort of took this hygiene hypothesis, this idea that the difference between farm kids and urban kids, the reason that farm kids have fewer allergies is that they are less exposed to microbial diversity. He took this idea and he sort of extended it further by going out and looking at three things. One is, what kind of surroundings are people growing up in? What kind of wildlife do they have in their immediate surroundings, like in their backyards? How many different kinds of plants are there, for example? How does this correlate with the diversity of the microbes on their skin? Okay, so looking specifically at the microbial nature of skin samples, are there correlations between that diversity and the diversity outdoors in their yards? And how does that all relate to their risk for allergies? And what Hansky found is that there is a link between these three factors. That the more diversity there was outside in your yard, and they just went around and counted the species of plants that were in people's yards, literally. So they found that the more diversity there was outside in your yard, the more diversity there was in the microbes that live on your skin. And likewise, that the more diversity there was in those microbes on your skin, the lower you were at risk of having allergies. Okay, so these three things were correlated. How diverse were your surroundings outside of your house? How diverse are the organisms that actually inhabit your body on your skin? And how much at risk are you for developing allergies? So they found that all these things are related. The more diversity there is outside, the more diversity there is on your skin, and the lower your risk for allergies. Okay, so native plant diversity outside is associated with increased microbial diversity on your skin, which leads to fewer allergies. So we still don't understand these connections. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about this area is that it's so new. We weren't even talking about microbes 20 or 30 years ago, and now we've started to realize how important they are, and so there are a whole lot of unanswered questions. And one is, how is it that having a lot of different kinds of plants in your yard ends up creating a rich, diverse microbial community on the surface of your skin? We don't know the answer to that question, but maybe even more important, Dunn points out, is how the diversity of microbes on your skin is going to lead to fewer allergies. Okay, so we're trying to understand these connections, and as explanations for why the microbial diversity on our skin could lead to less risk for allergies, there have been Dunn considers three proposed explanations, three proposals. So the first proposal is that because the job of your immune system is to distinguish between the good stuff and the bad stuff that's in your body, then it sort of needs practice at having lots of different things to analyze, to assess. Is this a risk or is this a benign intruder, right? In order to be able to do that job, it needs lots of practice. It needs lots of different kinds of organisms to be able to classify as threats or benign. And if you lack microbial diversity, if you lack a good, healthy, diverse microbiome, then your immune system isn't going to have the practice that it needs to tell apart the good stuff from the bad stuff. And that's why you might have allergies or a chronic inflammatory disease where your immune system thinks that something that's actually benign is harmful. So your immune system is making a mistake in how it categorizes these other organisms. And this first hypothesis is that the reason that is because the immune system hasn't had enough diverse organisms in your body to be able to get good at classifying the good stuff from the bad stuff. So it's making mistakes about what can actually hurt you. A second explanation is that you're more likely to have the good kinds of bacteria if you just have a lot of different kinds of bacteria. So if you don't have enough different kinds of bacteria, then you're likely missing out on bacteria that are really important and good and will help keep you healthy. And a third suggestion is that having more diverse bacteria can help fight off fungi, which fungi are more likely to cause allergies on this view. So, I was going to add a period, but that seems too complicated. Oh, let's try it. Okay, so the idea here is that bacteria and fungi, both part of your microbiome, are kind of in this struggle to fight off one another, they're in this competition, and that if you have enough diverse bacteria, then bacteria will win the competition, and that's good because the bacteria are more beneficial to you and the fungi are more likely to cause allergies. So this is a third theory. So we have three competing theories here. It's not clear which one of these theories, if any of them, is correct. Maybe it's some other explanation that we haven't thought of yet. Okay, but what's clear is this link that Hansky noted between having diversity in your surroundings, like in your yard, in your backyard, having diversity on your skin, a diverse microbiome, and your likelihood for developing allergies. So microbial diversity is important because it corresponds to our health in this way. And so it's important to understand why we are reducing microbial diversity. In which ways are we eliminating the diverse populations of organisms that live with us and on us? So one way is through habitat destruction, right? We pave over forests, for example. We take places where there used to be lots of different species interacting, and we replace them with places where there's only one species, or maybe even no species, because we just cover it in cement and put up a parking lot. We're going to watch a TED Talk that relates to this idea soon. But so one way that we reduce microbial diversity and biodiversity in general is by eliminating other kinds of species in our surroundings. Another way is that we clean our houses. We over clean. So we use antibiotics. We use antibiotic soaps, antibacterial soaps that say, this is especially good for killing the bacteria on your hands. And we use them just as a general practice when we don't really need to. And the same with antibiotics that we take as medicine to fight off disease. We're lucky that we have antibiotics, and we absolutely need to use them at certain times to help us survive and continue to thrive. But if we overuse them, then we end up eliminating good bacteria that we want around. The same with cleaning our houses with antibiotics. We end up eliminating the good stuff, and then we also leave, in place of the stuff we've killed and removed, we leave, that stuff gets replaced by species that are more threatening to us and more resistant to the antibiotics that we've used. So So that's one of the effects of the overuse of antibiotics, is that we create antibiotic resistant bacteria that could be harmful to us. And in addition, we eliminate a lot of the healthy bacteria that are more and more being known to enhance our health. So we want to keep them around, but we are doing a lot of things to eliminate them, to kill off this diversity. And Dunn says, we are reducing diversity in our daily lives, even on our bodies, in exactly the same way that we are reducing it in the world. We manage our own flesh as we manage the earth. So, a different way to think about biodiversity and the relation between humans and the environment, when we realize that part of the environment is actually inside of our bodies. And Dunn suggests that we need an ecological theory of disease, and he contrasts this with germ theory of disease. So germ theory says we get diseases when we have these bad germs, these bad microorganisms that invade our bodies, and then we get diseased. And to understand disease, we need to think about how these bad germs get into our bodies, right? How we can prevent the bad stuff from attacking our bodies. Well, an ecological theory of disease, on the other hand, says it's not just that we need to keep the bad stuff out. We actually need to cultivate, the good stuff, a diversity of healthy microorganisms in our surroundings and in our bodies, and that this will help prevent disease, and that it's a more important focus for thinking about disease prevention than just focusing on attacking the bad guys, because having a healthy microbiome will help us to be able to not get diseased even when the bad guys are around, right? Even when the bad germs are within us. If we have a healthy microbiome, then we can protect ourselves. Okay, so an ecological theory of disease says we need to think about all these interconnections and this kind of diversity of life that we are enmeshed within. So our normal status is to be enmeshed in other life, right? We're not just interconnected. We are fundamentally comprised of these other organisms. So it's deeper than just being in a tight relationship, right? It's actually, this is what our bodies are made of, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next article here that we're going to move on to. So I will come back to this question of an ecological theory of disease when I present some questions at the end of this lecture for you to think about. But this would really revolutionize how we think about medicine and how we think about our overall health and well-being. And finally, Dunn asks, could we rewild the places around us, plant a richness of species in our backyards, and so raise healthier children covered in more kinds of bacteria? So this is his hope, is that we can, now that we understand that there's a connection here, we can take action to promote the kinds of diverse microbial diversity that we want to keep us healthy. Okay, so moving on, now we're going to talk about health, ecology, and the human microbiome. And like I said, this is, the reason this is so fascinating to me is because it raises so many fundamental questions about how we think about life and ourselves as individuals, and even the title of the class, Humans and the Environment, whether we can really separate those two ideas. There's a cat walking by my yard. So whether we can really separate the idea of humans and the environment, or whether it's all kind of mixed together in these intricate ways that challenge the very notion of what it is to be human and what it is to be a unique individual. Okay, so we're going to look at different views of how we should understand this relationship between a human and their microbiome. And one thing that I want to mention is that the microbiome is actually the genetic makeup of all the microbes that live in you. So it's not the microbes themselves, but I'm sort of using it to mean that, which is common usage of that term. But if I wanted to be more precise, the microbiome itself is the genetic makeup of all of those microbes. that live within a certain person, a single person. So I'm going to continue just using microbes instead to talk about all the entire community of microorganisms that live on your body and within your body. Okay, so there are three views in this article that are presented of the relationship between a human and their microbiome. The first is called the holobiont perspective, the second is the ecological perspective, and the third is the ecosystems services perspective. And I've drawn a little illustration to capture each of these different ideas. So on the holobiont perspective, your microbiome is a part of you. You are an integrated individual, and you include as one of your parts a microbiome. And this sort of makes the microbiome to be something like a human organ, like your heart or your liver or your stomach, which I've illustrated here. But your microbiome is part of you, and we can think of it in the way that we think of any other part of you, like your heart or your stomach. Okay, so here you still have an integrated unit, a single individual, but it turns out that that individual is made up of various components, and one of those components is actually other organisms. Okay, so holobiont refers to the kind of thing that you are, which is a holobiont, which is a kind of collection of these other organisms as parts. Okay, the second perspective is the ecological perspective. And this view holds that, I've used these little squiggly things with dots in the middle to represent your microbiome, by the way, in these drawings, if that wasn't clear. But the ecological perspective says that you and your microbiome, it's not that your microbiome is a part of you. Instead, you and your microbiome together are part of this larger ecosystem that includes all of you. Okay, so some people who hold this view accuse the holobiont perspective that we just looked at of sort of a kind of chauvinism about the individual human, because we're just one among many creatures that are living within this space, right, within our skin barriers. And all of these creatures are important. And so evolutionarily and in other ways, it doesn't make sense to say that kind of you're the main one and these other creatures are sort of secondary, because all of these creatures are needed together to create this whole ecosystem which works in harmony with itself. This is the ecological perspective. And finally, we have the ecosystem services perspective, which holds that your microbiome is like a forest or something outside of your body, something over there that provides services to you. So it's an independent entity, the microbiome, and you are separate, in principle, separate, or at least separable from your microbiome. And we can view the microbiome simply in terms of how it benefits you or not. So the microbiome here is viewed as an independent system that provides services to you as the human. Okay, so these are the three different ways to think about the relationship between a person and their microbiome. So let's just review. So we have the holobiont perspective, which sees the microbiome as something like one of your organs. It's just another part of you. The ecological perspective, which sees you and the microbiome together as comprising this broader ecosystem. And we have the ecosystem services perspective, which views your microbiome as this separate system which is there to benefit you, the same way you might view a forest in that way for the lumber it could provide, or the way that it helps generate clean air. Okay, three perspectives. So in order to delve deeper into these questions of what really is you, right? Which part of the picture is you and which part of the picture is your environment? That's sort of the theme of the class, right? You and the environment, humans and the environment. So which part of the system is the human and which part of the system is part of the environment? And it gets confusing when you have distinct organisms living inside humans and necessary for humans to survive. Okay, so one way to sort of sharpen this question, to really think more deeply about this issue, is to look at notions of health, what it means to be healthy. Okay, and when we talk about health, we're talking about internal functioning, how a thing is doing internally. Okay, so when we ask this question, which part of the system is healthy or unhealthy, that helps us get at what actually comprises the individual and what is part of the individual's environment. So if you have something wrong with your microbiome, is it correct to think that you have a disease, like the way that if you had a problem with your heart, you'd have a diseased heart? Or is it more like living in polluted air, where if you have a problem with your microbiome, it's more like something's gone wrong with your environment, but it's not a disease that's part of your body, right? It's not like part of you that is diseased or ill. It's part of your environment. Okay, so looking at these conceptual questions of what it takes to be considered healthy or unhealthy, and how we think about the health of the microbiome in relation to the health of the individual human, can really help us illuminate some of these questions about identity and individuality and etc. Okay, so this is going to get more complicated in the next slide, but if you have questions about this stuff, please ask. It took me a long time to sort of wrap my head around what's going on in this very short 2.5 page essay. To me, it's really fascinating because I want to know who I am, right? And it turns out there's a lot of us inside of my body. And so trying to think through how we are connected, to me, is fascinating, which is why I wanted to share this article with you. But if you have questions, please ask them. And you might need to watch this section of the lecture a few times before you also are able to understand it. Okay, so before we get to the next slide, there are two things to point out about the terms health and how we're using the term health. So the first thing is that the author distinguishes between health and well-being. So when we talk about health, like I said, we're talking about the internal functioning of a thing, how that thing is doing internally. But this could be distinct from well-being. And the example they give is a dog who has a diseased gallbladder but doesn't experience any symptoms of that. Okay, so you could have cancer and not be aware, not have your life diminished in any way. Okay, so you still might have maximum well-being, right? You still might be maximally fulfilled and have a great life and feel great and otherwise have all your needs met. But it turns out that there's this disease within you, or if you're this dog, your gallbladder is diseased, and this could mean that you're not in perfect health, even though your well-being is not affected. So you still feel great. Okay, so, or you might be a tree who doesn't presumably have experiences, and you have a diseased tree where it's been attacked by a fungus or something, and the tree doesn't experience a decrease in well-being because it doesn't experience anything, as far as we know. So that's another example where the health of the tree is compromised, but not its well-being. So we're pulling those ideas apart here. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that when we talk about health, again, since we're talking about internal functioning, we're not talking about whether something is good for you. Okay, so you might be eating a salad and you think this is a really healthy salad, right? Well, we're not using healthy in that sense. When you say this is a healthy salad, what you mean is that the salad is good for you. It's going to make you healthy. It's going to contribute to your health if you eat it, right? It's not that we're talking about the salad being really in tip-top shape on its own, right? We're not talking about health in that way. So we have another term to capture that idea that's introduced in this article, which is healthful. So if you're eating a salad that's good for you, we would call that healthful, because we're not talking about the internal functioning of the salad. In fact, the salad is about to die, right? Because all the vegetables have been cut down and chopped up, and the salad is not healthy because it's not going to continue growing and thriving. But the individual who eats the salad will be healthier as a result. That's the idea. Okay, so healthy does not mean that it's beneficial to something else. Healthful means that. Okay, so we use the term healthful to talk about when something benefits another thing, the health of another thing, and we use the term healthy to talk about the internal functioning of the thing itself that's capable of, thriving and well, being healthy. And that's exactly what's at issue, is how we understand what it means to be healthy. Okay, so in this article, we take healthy to mean functionality, which I've mentioned. So we're talking about whether everything is sort of doing what it's supposed to be doing. Well, how do we understand that, right? What does it mean for a thing to be doing what it's supposed to be doing? Well, there are two ways that are presented to us in understanding we're trying to understand what it takes for a thing to be working like it should. And to clarify that, we get the notion of dysfunction. What happens when something's not working like it should, right? Maybe that will help us understand functionality. So there are two interpretations of dysfunction that the article presents. The first one has to do with natural selection, that a thing is unable to do what it's selected to do. So we're going to talk a bit more about that. And the second notion of dysfunction is what they call functional efficiency interpretation, where something being dysfunctional means that it's not contributing to a specific system in the way that other things like it typically contribute to those systems. Okay, so let's talk about each of these for a minute. Okay, so the first one, dysfunction, based on a notion of natural selection, says that a part, like a heart or your hand, is dysfunctional if it's not able to do what it was selected to do by natural selection. So what is natural selection? Well, natural selection is the idea that traits evolve that enable individuals who have them to survive and reproduce. Okay, so in the article, we get the example of a hand, and the reason that we have hands is because hands were able to grab onto stuff. And this ability, this trait of our hand to allow us to grab onto stuff is what enabled us, part of what enabled us to stay alive long enough to have offspring. Okay, so that's why your hand evolved to grab stuff. And if your hand is unable to grab stuff, then it's dysfunctional on this view. Okay, it's not able to fulfill its function. And that means your hand is unhealthy. Okay, if we're looking at this natural selection view of functionality. Okay, well, in order to apply this view back to our three perspectives of the relationship between a human and their microbiome, it's helpful to understand that natural selection, that having evolution by natural selection, requires three things. And those things are reproduction, variability, and heritability. Okay, so the first one, reproduction. In order to have evolution by natural selection, you have to have things that make copies of themselves. If nothing is reproducing, then you won't have any kind of selection pressure and no changes over time, which is evolution, right? Changes in how things are shaped through time. If nothing is making a copy of itself, you just have things as they are, and life would not continue to evolve, right? So you need reproduction in order to get evolution by natural selection. That's one of the things. Things have to be able to make copies of themselves. Okay, that's in an organism's case is reproduction. Okay, but other things make copies of themselves, like our genes make copies of themselves, and unicellular organisms can make copies of themselves. Okay, so you need this. You need things to be able to reproduce or make copies of themselves in order to have evolution by natural selection. Okay, you also need variability. That means you need differences within the population. Okay, you need differences both in the kinds of traits that they have, and we get differences through genetic mutations. But you need the individuals within that population to be different from one another, to have different traits, and to have differences in how likely they are to reproduce. Okay, so if you don't have that variability, then you also won't have evolution by natural selection, because it'd just be like a toss-up. Who makes it into the next generation? Okay, the reason we have evolution by natural selection is that there are differences between individuals. And so when we reproduce, those differences that better enable us to survive and reproduce, that increase what's in evolutionary biology called our fitness. Fitness is just the ability to survive and reproduce. Those differences affect our fitness, and that's why some traits evolve and others do not, right? If they make you more likely to reproduce, then they're more likely to be in succeeding generations. And if they make it impossible for you to reproduce, then they will not be in future generations. And the reason that is due to heritability, because we pass on our features through our genes to our offspring. Okay, so you have to be able to inherit those features from your parents in order for evolution by natural selection to occur. Okay, so reproduction, variability, and heritability. So we need to make copies of ourselves, and we need for there to be different kinds of traits and different fitness levels within our populations, and we need for those traits and fitness levels to be inheritable, to be able to inherit that stuff through genes from our parents and to be able to pass them to our offspring. Okay, so now's the really complicated part. So if you want to pause, take a break, and come back and review what we've just done, what we're going to do next is think about how this notion of functionality and health applies to the models of the microbiome that we were looking at earlier, the holobiont perspective, the ecological perspective, and the ecosystem services perspective. Okay, so let's start with the ecosystem services perspective, because I think that's the most straightforward. So because this perspective sees your microbiome as something independent of you, it's not the type of thing that's going to evolve by natural selection based on your evolutionary history, right? It's not as if this ecosystem is a part of what you're passing on through your genes to your offspring. It's a separate thing. And when we talk about health, we're talking about internal functioning. So already this perspective puts your microbiome outside of you in the sense that it treats it as an independent, separate entity whose value is based on what it does for you. So we're not talking about health anymore if we're talking about the status of the microbiome. We're talking, it would be more accurate to use the term healthful, like when we were talking about the salad, right? So an ecosystem, a microbiome that benefits you would be considered healthful, just the way a salad that's good for you, we would say is healthful if we're using these terms in the strict sense, which I've explained. Okay, so the ecosystem services perspective would not say that the microbiome itself is something that is healthy or unhealthy, or that's part of your health or your unhealthiness. It's part of your environment. It's outside of you in the sense that it's in principle independent of you. Okay, so health, we say a person is healthy, and if there's something wrong with your microbiome on this view, that would be a problem with your environment, with what's separate from you, not itself healthy or unhealthy. Unlike, for instance, your heart, right? If your heart has a problem, then we say you're unhealthy as a result because you have an unhealthy heart, okay? So So clearly on the ecosystem services perspective, because the microbiome is viewed as an independent entity, it's not considered part of your own health or unhealth. And it's not itself the kind of thing that could be considered healthy or unhealthy, because it's not the type of thing that evolves, right? That there's not selection pressure on that ecosystem as a whole, because what evolves is individuals with particular traits. Traits evolve within a population because they allow the individuals that possess them to survive and reproduce. But if we're looking at a whole ecosystem, a whole collection of organisms, then it's not the type of thing that natural selection applies to. It's not what's called a unit of selection. Okay, how about these other two? So again, we're talking about health as functionality, and we're using this notion of functionality that says the function of a thing is whatever it evolved, whatever it contributed to allow the individual who has it, who possesses it, to survive and reproduce. So whether a part is healthy depends on whether it can do the thing that allowed humans to evolve and reproduce, to survive and reproduce over time. So on both of these perspectives, because they both include these collections of organisms, the holobiont perspective says that these organisms are part of this integrated whole, which is you. And the ecological perspective says that you and the organisms are part of a broader ecological system. On both of these views, health, the microbiome is not the kind of thing that can be healthy or unhealthy, because it's not the kind of thing that enables an individual to survive and reproduce and gets passed on through genes to the next generation. The microbiome comes from your environment, and your parents don't pass on your microbiome the way they pass on your genetic material, right? They pass it on, or your mother at least passes on her microbiome in some sense, because you pass through the vaginal canal, like I've already mentioned, but it's not the kind of thing that you inherit through your genes. And so natural selection doesn't really apply here. And so if our notion of health is based on the idea of natural selection, the microbiome is not a candidate for something that should be considered healthy or unhealthy. It just is not the kind of thing that that term applies to. Those terms apply to. So this stuff is so complicated, and I'm sure that a lot of you are confused, and I want to help clarify this material as best as I can. And so please ask questions. Another way to try to grasp this material is to try to explain it to somebody else. But let me try to summarize. Hopefully I won't make things more complicated. But here's the question. We're asking whether our microbiome is a part of us, right? Is it part of us, or is it part of our environment? And to illuminate that question, we're looking at the notion of health. And the question related to health is the microbiome part of our health, right? If you have a diseased microbiome, is it an unhealthy part of you, or is it just a messed up part of your environment, the way polluted air is? Of course, polluted air affects you if you live in a polluted area, but it's not part of you in the way that having a diseased heart or a diseased liver is a part of you. So that's why we're asking about health here, to help us explore this question of how we should think about our microbiomes and their connection to us. And we've started now by looking at one notion of health. And that notion of health says a thing is healthy if it's able to do what it was selected to do. And on all of these perspectives that we've looked at of the relationship between a human and their microbiome, selection doesn't operate at the level of microbiomes, because microbiomes are collections of individuals, and natural selection is about traits that a single individual possesses that allow it to survive and reproduce, and therefore get passed into the next generation. Okay, so that's the best I can do to explain this very complicated material that took me a very long time to get my own mind around. But please ask questions, and I hope to discuss this with some of you further in office hours or things like that, or by email, or this is a great chance to also talk with people in your group about how to understand this material and make sense of it. Okay, so back to these notions of functionality. So again, the question is our microbiome a part of us, or is it part of our environment? And we're illuminating that question by asking, if our microbiome has a problem, does that mean we're unhealthy, or does that mean our environment is not good for us? And we've got these two interpretations of health, what it means to be healthy, or unhealthy, that inform this question differently. Okay, so the interpretation we take of dysfunction is going to change. Which interpretation we choose is going to change the answer to whether our microbiomes are really part of our health or part of the environment. Okay, so now we're going to look at this second interpretation. So we already looked at this first interpretation of dysfunction based on natural selection. Now we're going to look at the second interpretation, which says that it's not about natural selection. Natural selection has nothing to do with whether a part is healthy or unhealthy. Instead, what we should consider is whether something is able to play a role in a particular process. Okay, so if your microbiome, for example, plays an adequate role in digestion, which is one of the things it does for us, then it could be considered healthy. Or if it fails to fulfill that role, then it could be considered dysfunctional or unhealthy on this second interpretation. Okay, so how do we know what's an adequate role? How do we know if the microbiome is doing a good enough job at helping us with digestion? Well, we compare it to other people's microbiomes and how they help with their digestion. Okay, so we compare it to others who play the same role in similar members of a broader population. So the question here, if we're asking whether our microbiome is healthy or not, the question is, does it contribute to digestion enough like other microbiomes contribute to the digestion of other individuals in your society? You're in a broader population. Okay, so the question is not, does it do what it was selected to do? We're not talking about natural selection anymore. On this second interpretation of dysfunction, we're talking about playing a certain role within a broader system or process. Okay, so let's look back to our models here of the relationship between a human and their microbiome. So on the ecosystem services perspective, the microbiome is, again, not going to be the type of thing that can be healthy or unhealthy because it's an independent entity on this view. It's independent of you. It's out there in the sense that it's not an integrated part of what makes you you. Right? It's part of your environment, more like a forest would be. Okay, so on this perspective, the ecosystem, which is the microbiome itself, that doesn't include you, is not the type of thing that could be healthy or unhealthy because it's not a part of you that's performing a certain role. It's an independent thing that is performing that role, more like forest generating clean air is performing the role of allowing you to continue breathing, right? It's not a part of your body. It's a separate thing, even though it's on and inside your body. Okay, so again, on the ecosystem services perspective, the microbiome on this view, the functional efficiency view of health, the microbiome is not the kind of thing that's correctly considered healthy or unhealthy. But these other two perspectives, the holobiont perspective and the ecological perspective, would say that the microbiome is the type of thing that can be healthy or unhealthy if we're using this functional efficiency view of health. And the reason is that in both of these cases, the microbiome is a part of a larger system that and has roles to play within that larger system. Okay, and so we can compare those roles to how the microbiome plays that role in other individuals, and then it will be considered healthy or functional if it does at least a good job as the other microbiomes around it, right? Like my microbiome is healthy for digesting my food if it's at least as good as most of your microbiomes are at helping you digest your food. Okay, so I hope that helps clarify how this notion of health based on functional efficiency is related to each of these perspectives, the holobiont and the ecological perspective. Because both will say that your microbiome can be considered healthy or unhealthy. That is, we can think of whether a microbiome is doing what it's supposed to be doing based on how it's contributing to certain systems within our body and how that relates to other people's microbiomes fulfilling their role within other systems in their bodies. Okay, so let me try to summarize all of this section of the lecture based on this article, Health, Ecology, and the Microbiome, one more time. So I hope I won't confuse you more. And again, just want to really encourage you to not be discouraged by the complexity of this material. And I hope I've shown you why it's interesting, because it really changes how we think of ourselves and who we are, and whether we can even think of ourselves as individuals, whether we can even draw that distinction between humans and the environment, or if we should really think of ourselves as communities of individuals, because when you peek inside, that's what you find is lots of different kinds of organisms that are all working together. So I hope I've sort of conveyed some of why this stuff is fascinating, at least to me. Let me try to summarize this section of the article. So again, we're this article, this section of the lecture. So again, we're looking at how we should think about individuals, right? What is the connection between a person and all these organisms that live in and on their bodies? Okay, is it one thing or is it multiple things? And we considered 3 different perspectives on that. One that sees the other organisms as a part of you, like your heart. That's the holobiont perspective. A second perspective sees you and your microorganisms as making up a community together. Okay, so the unified whole is sort of a collection of all of these things working together. And the third perspective sees your microbiome as something independent of you, like a forest or the air around you, that certainly affects you and affects your health and plays an important role in your health, but not in a more profound way than the air around you or the river that you get your water from, or et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so on this ecosystem services perspective, this final perspective, the microbiome is separate from you. Okay, so to help illuminate this question of whether our microbiome is actually part of us or whether it's something separate and how we should think of it, we looked at the notion of health. And we're asking specifically if your microbiome is unhealthy or has a problem. Does that mean it's unhealthy? Like your heart is unhealthy if your heart has a problem? Or does it mean it's just got a problem that's separate from you, like if the air is problematic, the air that you're breathing? Okay, so would it be correct to say that your microbiome is healthy or unhealthy? Or would it be better to say like it's not beneficial, or it is beneficial, but it's not itself healthy or unhealthy, like a salad? And the way we answer that question depends on how we understand what it is to be healthy. And so we looked at 2 views of health. One view says health, the notion of health is based, well, both views say that health is a matter of functionality, is a matter of everything doing what it's supposed to do. One view said that the way to understand that is in terms of natural selection. That if something's doing what it's supposed to do, it's doing the thing that it's done to enable people like you to survive, beings like you to survive and reproduce. The other view said natural selection is not a part of it. If a thing is doing what it's supposed to do, that just means it's playing a role in a broader process that's at least as good as the things like it play that role in other individuals. Okay, and which of those views of health and functionality we adopt affects our answer to this first question of whether we should think of our microbiomes as something that's a part of us that can be healthy or unhealthy, like our organs, or if we should think of it as part of our environment, as something that may be good for us or not, but that's not actually a part of our own health, a constitutive part of our own health. Okay, so of course, everyone agrees that your microbiome is going to affect your health, just like the air you breathe is going to affect your health. But your heart is going to affect your health in a more profound and intimate way by being a constitutive part of your health. It's what your health is made up of, right? A healthy heart is part of what being a healthy person boils down to. Okay, so again, the question is whether your microbiome is like that, like a heart, or another part of you, and so is unhealthy or healthy in the way that a body part can be unhealthy or not, or if it's part of your environment, and so health and dysfunction are not exactly the right concepts to apply to your microbiome. Okay, and let me just reiterate that this has changed the way we think about fundamental biological questions like natural selection in the first place. Because if it turns out that what we think of as like a prototypical individual, right? A human is like the most individual we get, right? If we think of like what is a prime example of a unique individual, a human being is like pretty much at the top of that list. But it turns out that even us, even we human beings, if you look closely at our skin and our intestines, for example, you find out that we're not just one thing, we're a whole bunch of things working together. And so if natural selection, for example, is based on how individuals are enabled to survive and reproduce, then it turns out that what we think of as an individual is actually a community. Then we have to rethink the basis of how we conceive of evolution by natural selection. Okay, and so a lot of these changes are just beginning to be appreciated. A lot of these challenges to traditional ways of thinking about biology and human health and related issues. Okay, so I hope that I've helped make sense of this in some way for you to get your mind around it, and that I've encouraged you to think more about your own microbiome. And before we go, I want to leave you with a few questions. So, one thing I haven't talked about yet, because it would add one too many layers of complexity to this discussion, but is the idea of group selection. So, most people, well, I don't know if most people, but a lot of biologists, evolutionary biologists, think that group selection is also possible. So it's not just about, natural selection is not just about whether a trait enables an individual to survive and reproduce, but it could be about whether a trait enables members of a group to survive and reproduce. Okay, so a lot of people think this is the only way, including Darwin, thought that group selection is necessary in order to make sense of traits like a bee who dies after it stings an intruder. Okay, because stinging and dying are not going to help the bee itself to survive and reproduce. But if a colony of bees has a lot of bees that do that manifest that behavior of stinging intruders, even though it's a suicidal act, then the colony is more likely to survive and reproduce and make more of these altruistic, suicidal stinging bees, because that behavior will help protect the colony. Okay, so some people think that it's not just evolution that happens at the individual level. We have to consider how traits affect groups as a whole when some individuals in the group possess them. So it may be that some behaviors are beneficial to groups and allow groups as a whole to outcompete other groups. Okay, we're talking about groups of individual organisms. Well, it may be that the correct way to think of your microbiome is as a group that evolves, and then the different views of health that we already discussed might be relevant again. We might be able to make sense of a definition of health based on natural selection that applies to microbiomes if we incorporate this idea of group selection. Okay, so that is a whole other topic for a whole other lecture. The second question I want to ask you is to think more about Dunn's proposal that we develop an ecological theory of disease. Okay, so Dunn thinks instead of seeing disease as a matter of, defending ourselves against bad germs, what would it look like to try to cultivate a healthy, quote unquote, right? So we know now that term is contentious, but what would it look like to cultivate a real diverse array of microbes that allow us to remain healthy? Okay, what would it look like if that were the aim of medicine, one of the aims of medicine, right? If we took that approach to fighting disease, that is cultivating a community of organisms that make disease less likely. And finally, the last question I want to ask is, where did you grow up? Did you grow up on a farm? Probably, since you're at NC State, a lot of you did grow up on farms. And how do you think that has affected your overall health? So do you think you have been affected by your surroundings during your childhood and adolescence? And how so, if so? Okay, that was a whole lot, and I hope you will take time to take it all in and maybe enjoy a nice cold bottle of kombucha or some kefir, and cultivate a healthy microbiome. I will see you next time.